Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're using the unique geography of Helena, Alabama, as our ultimate real-world stress test to uncover the high-stakes science of professional water damage restoration. We're going to look at exactly what happens when water escapes its boundaries inside your home. And trust me, it behaves a lot more aggressively than you probably think. By looking at a specific region with some pretty intense environmental pressures, we can really start to understand the universal mechanics of how water wrecks a house, and more importantly, how science steps in to stop it.
When we think of a flood, we usually picture raging rivers or massive severe storms. But honestly, the reality is usually much closer to home. A seemingly minor plumbing failure, like a broken water heater, can instantly dump 40 to 50 gallons of water right across your floors. And if you're dealing with a burst supply line, oh man, you could be looking at a release of hundreds of gallons per hour. That is a massive, massive volume of liquid being introduced into a dry, enclosed environment in the literal blink of an eye.
Which leads us to a really critical scenario. Considering just how incredibly fast water spreads through porous building materials, do you actually know what happens inside your wall cavities just 24 hours after a leak begins? Most of us just focus on the puddle on the floor, right? But the real danger, the hidden mechanics of a household disaster, is what that water is doing where you can't even see it. Let's move into part one, the anatomy of a water emergency, and why your local geography actually dictates your home's vulnerability, because a leak absolutely does not happen in a vacuum. It's super interesting when you look at the stark contrast in local threats drawn from our stress test city. Older neighborhoods like Helena Highlands, for example, face failures from aging galvanized and polybutylene pipes. These are notorious older plastic materials that literally just reach the end of their lifespan and burst completely without warning. But newer developments definitely aren't immune either. They often experience leaks stemming from rushed installations or modern appliance failures. So whether your house is 50 years old or 5 months old, that vulnerability to sudden water intrusion is always there. It's just coming from different sources.
Now, couple those infrastructure vulnerabilities with the local geography. In our test environment, you've got dense red clay that acts literally like a giant bowl, pooling storm runoff right up against foundations instead of letting it naturally drain away. Add in seasonal flash flooding your local waterways like Buck Creek, and then top the whole thing off with a summer humidity that regularly exceeds 75%. What you end up with is a perfect storm for rapid property damage. The environment outside is actively fighting against the drying process inside.
And this brings us to a highly destructive physical property called capillary action. Think of a dry paper towel dipping into a spilled drink. Water seemingly defies gravity to wick right up the drywall, sometimes several feet above the visible water line on the floor. It doesn't just sit there, it climbs. It soaks deep into your insulation, into your structural framing, and behind your baseboards. That visible puddle you're stressing over, that's really only a fraction of the actual moisture intrusion. Which perfectly segues into part two, the 3 categories of water, and how we classify the contamination threat level. Because look, not all water is created equal, and how the pros respond depends entirely on what exactly is soaking into your floors. Category 1 is clean water, stuff coming from supply lines or melting snow. It's clean initially, but if you leave it alone, it's going to degrade. Then you've got category 2, which is gray water. This comes from appliances like dishwashers or washing machines, so it carries a moderate amount of contamination. And finally, category 3, black water. This is from sewage backups or flash flooding. It is highly toxic, loaded with dangerous bacteria and pathogens that require full, specialized decontamination protocols just for a crew to step inside to make the home safe again. Okay, let's jump into part 3. This is the absolute most unforgiving element of all of this, the ticking clock of mold and that critical 48-hour window. Once water gets into your home, a strict countdown timer starts. You just don't have the luxury of waiting around. In hour 1, water is instantly spreading and infiltrating those porous materials. Then the danger escalates incredibly fast. Mold begins colonizing in warm, humid conditions, remember those 75% humidity summers we mentioned, within just 24 to 48 hours. That is your absolute, non-negotiable window to get ahead of the problem. Because proper structural drying typically requires 3 to 5 full days of continuous industrial equipment operation to actually complete. And if you miss that crucial 48-hour containment window, the consequences multiply fast. Hidden moisture trapped in wall cavities and poorly ventilated crawl spaces creates these dark, discolored patches. You'll start to notice very distinct, musty odors. But much more importantly, it leads to severe respiratory and allergic health risks for your family, all while simultaneously eating away at the structural integrity of your home's framing. It essentially turns a bad structural issue into a really serious biological one. So how do we actually fix it?
Let's look at Part 4, the professional restoration process, following strict IICRC S500 standards.
Because, guys, this is not about pointing a couple of box fans at a wet carpet and crossing your fingers. It's a heavily regulated, completely scientific operation. First, professionals perform immediate assessments using thermal imaging cameras to literally see behind your walls and find that hidden wicking moisture. Second, they do rapid water extraction while immediately applying EPA-registered antimicrobial treatments to stop any mold in its tracks. Finally, they initiate continuous structural drying, which is completely governed by complex psychrometric calculations. That's essentially the exact science of measuring air, moisture, and heat to ensure the environment is actively pulling moisture right out of the walls.
And the sheer scale of the industrial equipment they bring in for this is staggering. We're talking about massive truck-mounted extractors that pull water deep out of carpet padding. They use heavy-duty HEPA air scrubbers to isolate and capture dangerous mold spores. They even deploy specialized injection drying systems designed specifically to force dry air under high-end hardwood floors so they don't buckle and warp. This hardware is loud, it is intense, and it completely outperforms any standard household dehumidifier you could ever pick up at a local hardware store.
But they don't just plug all this gear in and walk away. Technicians will return to adjust those commercial dehumidifiers every single day until those exact psychrometric calculations show that safe moisture levels have been achieved. Only then does the complete property reconstruction begin. And throughout this entire ordeal, they are compiling comprehensive moisture logs and photographic evidence and submitting all of that directly to your insurance adjuster to prove the science was followed, ensuring your coverage is actually honored.
All right. Finally, Part 5, actionable takeaways. What you need to do in the chaotic first minutes of a disaster.
Because what you do before the pros even arrive can dramatically shrink the scope of the damage. Here is your immediate battle plan. First, you absolutely must know where your main water valve is and shut it off to stop the bleeding. You can definitely use mops for small surface puddles. And here's a massive pro tip. Lift your furniture onto aluminum foil blocks to save your carpets from permanent wood stain bleeding. But please, pay attention to the don'ts here. You must absolutely never use a standard household vacuum for water extraction. You will instantly ruin the vacuum, and way more importantly, you risk electrocution. And never, ever enter rooms with standing water if there are potential electrical hazards present. Your safety is always paramount.
Which leaves us with one final, urgent question to consider about your own home's readiness. Based on everything we've uncovered today, considering just how aggressively water wicks through a house, how incredibly fast mold colonizes, and the massive industrial response required to save a structure, are you truly prepared to stop the clock when the first drop falls? Think about exactly where your shutoff valves are right now and what your plan is. Because when a water emergency strikes, time is the one thing you absolutely cannot restore.